well into the southern Indian Ocean, the Indian fort also ought to and is playing now, will play a greater role in exerting influence overseas and bolstering the fleet.
Would you say that, in this, as these weapons become more and more capable and their ranges become longer and longer, and this applies not only to the Navy, but I would say also to the Air Force, etc., that if you're firing at long ranges, the emphasis is more on the weapon than the platforms. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Dialogues. Once again, I'm delighted to have Admiral Shrikhande along with me over here today. And today we thought we'll revisit certain maritime concepts. So we've done around 2 or 3 episodes on which we've dealt with various aspects. The first I thought we'd talk about is the episode that I did with Admiral Raja Menon on fleet versus fort. And the basic conceptualization was that today, as the ability of land to influence the battle at sea is getting larger and larger in terms of the weapons that can be launched from land and which can be distributed, they can be hardened, they can be concealed, they can be regenerated. And therefore, the ability for them to influence the battle at sea will therefore go up, and it becomes more and more difficult for ships to operate in a contested environment near to coastlines. Would you like to take it ahead from there, sir?
Yes. So Monty, what you had mentioned in one of those episodes was also very important, that in many ways we have reached inflection points. Whereas, the issues that Admiral Raja Menon and Admiral Chauhan brought up were also very valid. And very insightful, that there are certain trends and there are certain constants, and we need to be aware of that, and there are changes that everybody recognizes. But I think what you said about inflection points is, I think, more true now than it was at previous stages of naval warfare. Why is that? It is precisely because of the reasons you brought out, that the fleet and fort can combine their overall capability against an enemy's fleet or against an enemy's fleet and fort. The combinations could be various. It is, let's say, in the Western Pacific, it is the Chinese fort, which is the overall other capabilities of the PLA that you had already flagged in terms of missiles, shore-based aircraft, and cyber and space also are fundamentally housed in the fort.
Right.
And combined with the fleet, where the fleet may at some stage play a major role or a minor role or a relatively minor role, the architectures in both places, as you brought out in some of the discussions in terms of distributed operations, the distribution is available both at sea as well as on land. And how do you combine that distribution through networking, through surveillance, through ISR, for greater ranges at which you can establish sea control or sea denial as the outcome, as the enabling condition, will be very important. So therefore, we are at a stage where we have to think more and more in terms of fort and fleet. And in India's case also, how do we use the fort and the fleet against our adversaries, whether it is Pakistan or whether it is China? And there are creative ways of thinking about it, and I'm sure the powers that be are doing that. So in terms of combining these assets and creating conditions of sea control and sea denial are very, very important. And this therefore is the kind of inflection points of, that we need to think of, because things have changed in terms of, as you pointed out, the greater ranges of weapons and the greater ranges at which platforms can go to launch these weapons. So as it came out, ultimately it boils down to delivering ordnance on target, as Admiral Chauhan was saying, and certainly it has, for millennia it has been so. and the ways of delivering that ordnance, the accuracies of delivering that ordnance, the ranges at which you can deploy platforms that deliver their ordnance, and the variety of platforms, both within the fort and fleet, that can impose effects which serve the enabling conditions of sea control or sea denial, are, I think, increasing so much that this is, I think, a fascinating time, I think, to be a young leader in the Navy, and unfortunately we are on the other side of the hill.
So let me just push that argument slightly, sir. So I fully agree with you. I mean, if you conceptualize maybe a PNA Navy ingress into the Indian Ocean, and if I can understand if they're in the deep south of the Indian Ocean, it largely becomes a maritime battle. But as they come up further and further north, you develop that asymmetry by getting land-based power and a combination of land-based power and sea-based power to combat what is essentially only a sea-based power in that sense. And that gives you you can develop some degree of asymmetry by putting this combination together, sir. But on the other hand, sir, you've seen these. I mean, we've talked about weapon ranges. I mean, we started off with the DF-21D as an anti-ship ballistic missile at 2,000 kilometers, the DF-26 to 4,000, the DF-27 to 6,000. Just around 4 days back, you had this parade on the 3rd of September, where you had a variety of new weapons which have been displayed, and ranges are still not as certain, but certainly hypersonics, etc., all coming into play now in quite a big way. So are we now, is it possible that you reach a point where these ranges extend 6, 8, 10,000 kilometers, that the fleet altogether may not come into play? I mean, on the defending side, you can have only the land combating another fleet at sea. It need not be a combination at all. So it really boils down to just fleet versus fort in that case.
Yes, it can. Actually, it can, and that's a distinct possibility that, let's say, the People's Republic of China can reorient some or much of that architecture, onto the Indian Ocean, as they seem to be now,
Yes.
oriented towards the Western Pacific, and that's quite possible, and we should be alive to that possibility that the fort can wield, wield weapons that can be very effective, and the aspect of, therefore, the ISR that is available. We have seen some of that happening even in recent operations. The potential or the suspected assistance of targeting information that adversaries might have because of their own friends. So this is now a game that is at our doorstep, so to speak. And you're right that the kind of ranges that the Chinese could have, or others also have, even the Americans have, and we are also developing that.
Right.
So certainly, even well into the southern Indian Ocean, the Indian fort also ought to, and is playing now, will play a greater role in exerting influence overseas, and bolstering the fleet in doing what it needs to do. And here, there is one very interesting aspect that Admiral Bilu Chauhan brought out, which was on analogies of sports, and they are good analogies, about chess players. For instance, he said, in a football match or in a chess, the pieces are laid out. But I think the analogy is very attractive, but also is problematic, because
I think he used the example of football, if I'm not mistaken.
yes, football as well as chess, as well as chess. Now, two things come to my mind is that sports are always played by rules. There are strict rules, that govern that. Even if, one player has transparency over the other person's chess pieces, he may not know his mind, how he might use, but a trained mind would start guessworking. So the chess player would have also done a chess player's estimate of the situation. If the enemy changes something, if the adversary changes something, what do I do? But the problem here is that when we talk about conflict and combat, what if that other chess player, instead of playing chess, just pulls out a gun and shoots the other chess player? Now, that's not according to the rules. Nowhere in the rules of chess, can a chess player be shot dead so that he is not available to play. I'm stretching the analogy, of course. So in football, so But this brings out to the other point that you've often brought out, and you speak about so deeply on, that is the transparency that is changing. Those are also inflection points, and it is also true that in any transparency there will be still gaps, but the gaps are reducing, and the tracking information is increasing, and it is increasing for all sides. So it is not as if one side has overwhelming advantage than the other side, at least when we are talking about peers. When you are talking about peer minus minus, that means adversaries, like the US has fought many adversaries or deployed against many adversaries who do not have the architectures, the wherewithal, and the forces to be able to impose the kind of sort of pressure or even punishment that they can impose. So if one side has asymmetric advantages where you can impose a lot of punishment, but the enemy's ability to impose reverse punishment or countermeasures are limited, then it's a different sort of picture in which you do that, and there may be a problem of taking those analogies and applying them to peer situations. And in India's case, in many ways, we are talking about near peer or peer adversaries when it comes to China and Pakistan. So the situations are a bit different.
So many things that you've mentioned over here, sir. But one thing I just thought I'll talk about very briefly is that when it comes to long-range strike, I mean, you rightly pointed out that it's key for us now to develop, weapons that can go out a long way and extend the range of the Indian fort also into the deep ocean, right? And so far, and also I think conversely, you also have to develop ways and means to protect yourself against similar weapons when they're coming your way also. Would you say that, in this, as these weapons become more and more capable and their ranges become longer and longer, and this applies not only to the Navy, but I would say also to the Air Force, etc., that if you're firing at long ranges, the emphasis is more on the weapon than the platforms.
Yes.
So, in a sense, the weapon trumps the platform, because now, if you're firing at close ranges, I mean, going back, if you go to the Second World War, when you started off with guns, for example, battleships, when you're close to each other, then of course you have to have your protection measures, armor, etc. If you're firing at tremendously long distances, then in several ways you are immune to any sort of detection at times, and therefore you need not have very expensive capabilities that are concomitant to protect yourself in that sense. So if you, when it comes to putting your money down into research and development and things like that, would you say that this subtle drift has to take place where we start investing more into weapons than platforms?
Yes, I agree with that. That is the other big change that may be taking place. Here there are a few issues that we could talk about. One is that it's our tendency, because of our own backgrounds, for each service in each country, to learn the lessons from a conflict that you want to learn, and many of those lessons that we emphasize at the cost of perhaps some different lessons that we ought to be looking at, is because of our instinctive conservatism to preserve the status quo, and therefore we are pushing sometimes stealth in platforms or complexities in platforms, exactly for the reason that you brought out, that they may be less relevant now, and therefore given budget constraints, I think we need to develop perhaps simpler platforms that may lack the sophistication of the platform weapon combination. And what you said is very valid, because there was a time 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, because of lower weapon ranges, the platforms also needed to be more relatively sophisticated and capable. Now that part is reducing, and the platforms can be less sophisticated. They could be manned, they could be unmanned, they could be combinations, and the ability of the weapons to in terms of precision, in terms of resistance to countermeasures, and in creativity of overcoming countermeasures is very important. So in one of the earlier discussions there was a good point that I think Admiral Chauhan flagged, is that we learn on our feet, so to
Right.
speak, like the Iranian, Turkish drones, etc., that were used in the initial parts
Right.
of the Ukrainian war, slowly became difficult to use because the countermeasures now overwhelmed them, and they had to, both sides develop newer ways of developing countermeasures and measures. So the game of measures and countermeasures will go on, and warships also need to come up with newer and newer defenses to be able to take care of the offensive capabilities, because the defensive capabilities are also very important. And what Admiral Chauhan said was right, that it is about not only float, move, fight, but survive also. Although where I would differ is that the term survive was always inherent. We have never ignored that in our Navy. It wasn't part of the float, move, fight sort of triptych. But the fourth one, survive, was always inherent. Perhaps it wasn't mentioned like that because it was so obvious. And this again came home, to us for a few years after 71, and again after the Falklands experience, where ship construction then went went through a bit of a change again, when ships were made a little differently in terms of avoiding aluminium superstructures, etc., because of the experience of the Falklands War. So I think survive part has always been with us. Right. And this all these complications bring us to the other aspect also of how operations have to adapt. And good examples are often given, both these officers who we hold in great regard gave the example of infantry. And of course, infantry has always existed. So nothing goes obsolete overnight, and nothing that is new becomes, the all-dancing weapon or all-dancing weapon and platform combination also overnight. The changes are more gradual. So the analogy of infantry soldiers is valid, but it also has some weaknesses, because if we see how an infantry soldier operated in, say, 1914 in the First World War to now, it's been a sea change for very similar analogies that you brought out in terms of lethality of a single infantry soldier, the lethality of countermeasures against that infantry soldier, the great advantages today that infantry soldiers have in terms of networking and in terms of leveraging
his weapons that can be
other people's weapons. So that coordination is in many ways within the fort of the infantry. A lot is happening, and within an infantry man's ability to survive, navies also play a role in terms of ground support, in terms of ISR, and these are things that are happening even in the subcontinent, and we are also developing those. So yeah.
So, let's shift tack now to the issue regarding some on sea control, sea denial. If you recollect, we had done this quite early in our series in WM Dialogues. I thought we'll just revisit this and take certain, just to get a little more clarity. So, when we talk sea control, sea denial, we mean that sea control is required by someone who requires to use the sea. And if sea denial, as the term speaks, is if I do not need to use it and you need to use it, then my intention is only to deny you the use of the sea, then it is sea denial. So that is understood. The other thing is that largely we would say is that sea denial would be a subset of sea control. I mean, sea control is overarching, and therefore sea denial is very much built into sea control. The third issue is that sea control and sea denial are both wartime functions. Presence would be a peacetime function, and it translates either into sea control or sea denial at the moment combat starts. The fourth thing I would say is that if you look at any two countries or two situations, you can have a country that needs to use certain areas or need not use certain areas. And the same applies to the other country. So if both need to use, you end up in a situation of contested sea control.
Yes.
If one needs to use and the other does not need to use, then you can have one country which is seeking sea control and the other one which is pursuing a sea denial strategy. If both don't need to use, then actually there's no contest.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it would be foolish for two sea denial forces to sort of engage each other.
Yes, they could more efficiently, do stuff to each other in other places.
Elsewhere.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it would be just a waste of resources in a sense. So let's take this a little further right now. When it comes to assets, because sometimes, as we discussed during the last episode, that we get locked into this conceptualization that certain types of assets are meant for a certain role and the others are not meant for. Would you like to again revisit this issue, sir?
Yes, Monty, I think we can revisit that because if we can just walk back a little bit, many of us grew up in the Navy with some misconceptions about, let's say Pakistan having a sea denial strategy vis-a-vis India, which was faulty on two counts. Firstly, as we mentioned earlier, that sea denial and sea control are not strategies, although they are very often called that, but they are wrong. They are enabling conditions which fit into, maritime and naval strategies that may be required for those purposes, those objectives in that context. The other aspect is that Pakistan also would require a measure of sea control because it would need to use the sea for ensuring, whatever limited trade that they might still want
Close to their coast.
And for their own naval purposes. So they would require sea control further out against our coast and in our coastal waters, or to some extent further out in our littoral itself. Sea denial may be what the condition that they aspire for, and that's where we will establish sea control. And if we don't want to use the Makran coast for offensive operations against Pakistan, then we are also imposing a measure of sea denial on them because we don't need to use that coast. Although what would happen in many conditions, it would be a part of our strategic objectives that we will use the coast to impose punishments. And from what one can surmise from the media in Sindoor also, our Navy was well poised to be able to strike. And the decision to strike or not strike, of course, the circumstances would be different. But sea control and sea denial, as you brought out, have to be seen in that context, that sea denial is inherent in sea control. That means you want to deny the other side, whereas sea denial can operate elsewhere. So between India and China, as we've said earlier, I think by and large through most parts of the Indian Ocean, there would be contested sea control, and whose effectiveness over time to have the upper hand in that sea control will probably turn the maritime picture in their own favor. And I think the Indian Navy, with the fort and the fleet and our geographical advantages, would be well poised to be able to achieve the upper hand.
Taking that argument slightly ahead, sir, and I think we discussed this even earlier, is that while in a India-China context, we both have a requirement to use the seas in the Indian Ocean, and therefore there's going to be contested sea control. But and we've already discussed, there's no such thing as two parties engaging in sea denial because you might as well use those forces elsewhere. But you can end up in a situation where, while my desire is to use the seas, and to do that, I have to firstly prevent you from using the seas, and therefore, because sea denial is a subset of sea control. Yes. So I can achieve the sea denial part, but I do not have the wherewithal to take it beyond into freeing myself up. I do not have the wherewithal to be able to use the seas. And this again comes back to the fort versus fleet argument, and particularly with long-range weapons like the anti-ship ballistic missile, that supposing both parties have this, and progressively moving ahead, you will find that more and more countries are going to have long-range vectors of this nature. That even when both parties want to use the seas, and so you have to go past sea denial and then establish sea control, but you all end up in both of you achieving sea denial and not being able to take it forward into sea control. Yes. So you end up in a mutual sea denial sort of situation.
Yes, it could well be. It could well be that. That's a very interesting aspect. I would say that if we then analyze particular situations, then a nation that is able to use its fort also to deny the other side use of that sea also helps then their own side to use the sea in a limited way at least. So therefore one side probably will still be better situated to be able to say we have some measure of sea control. Now, the issue about sea control and sea denial or sea control is like control anywhere, like favorable air situation.
It's not
never
black and white.
absolute.
Yeah.
It's not absolute. You will have challenges. And this is where actually, sometimes Navy people and Army people also overstate the aspect of what Admiral Wiley said, that, the soldier with the rifle is control. Except that the soldier with the rifle is control, but that control can also be challenged by snipers, by the other side, by rump elements, or by by insurgents and terrorists also. So in no situation, in no dimension, I think is control absolute, and that is where sometimes we conflate sea control and sea control with command of the sea. But command of the sea sometimes spans such a preponderance of naval command or ability that there are no challengers, and you can, after destroying the other side, you can have command of the sea. So we could in many ways come into a resultant mutual sea denial, but somewhere if we go deeper into it, one side probably has a higher measure of sea control in time and space in certain areas, and the other side has in certain other areas. So it remains complex, and that's where people who define sea control and sea denial in terms of time and space, limited in terms of time and space, were actually onto the right thing. So there would be, if we were to make a colored map of sea areas, where one side has a better quality of sea control, the other side has achieved a higher quality of sea denial, it would be a fairly colorful mosaic. But the important point that you made, and we can speak a little more about it, is therefore the role that the fort plays in all this, and that's the central point that you've been also trying to convey, is that those are the important sort of things that we need to think a lot more about. It's uncomfortable, but we need to think about that, because those are the lessons we also need to learn, take home. And in many ways, the way I like to put it is that newer challenges require newer strategic imagination, newer ways of operational brilliance, and newer ways of tactical audacity to impose at the tactical level elements of surprise despite all the challenges, rather than be surprised.
So I think, sir, what comes out from this conversation, I think it's a great time to be in the Navy right now. I mean, that the sky is the limit. The challenges are immense, but it is a time, I think, that if you apply yourselves, it's always about finding creative solutions to problems. And I envy today's young officer.
Same here.
That he's got a lot on his plate. But it's an interesting time also to find some very creative solutions to problems as they evolve, and they're evolving much more rapidly, I think, today than what we witnessed in our times.
Yeah.
So with that, sir, I think we'll call it a day today.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
And thank you once again for participating.
It's
in
a
this
pleasure always
conversation.
to sit and
And
talk with you.
Look forward to many such conversations in future.
Thank you very much.